Before we begin this incredible story of property battles, unexpected alliances, and shocking revelations, we'd like to ask for just one small favor. If you enjoy stories about HOAs, Karen drama, and neighborhood chaos, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. It really helps us bring you more stories like this, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next in this tale. Now, let's get started. At first glance, Willow Creek Estates looked like a dream come true. A neatly planned suburban community on the edge of a growing city, it boasted manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, and rows of nearly identical houses that gleamed in the sunlight. Real estate ads called it the most desirable neighborhood in the county, promising peace, safety, and family-friendly values. New residents often moved in with the expectation of stability and harmony, but those who had lived there long enough knew the truth. Perfection always comes at a cost. Behind the white picket facades and smiling greetings at block parties, there existed a shadowy network of grudges, whispered complaints, and rigid enforcement of rules. The Willow Creek HOA wasn't just a homeowners association, it was a kingdom. And every kingdom needs a ruler. In Willow Creek, that ruler was Margaret Henderson. Margaret, now in her early 60s, had lived in Willow Creek since the very first houses were built. She styled herself as a guardian of the neighborhood's standards, insisting that without her guidance, the place would fall into chaos. She never missed an HOA meeting, chaired every committee worth joining, and ensured that no detail escaped her notice, from the shade of curtains visible through a window to the placement of garbage cans on collection day. To new homeowners, her smile seemed welcoming. But in time, most discovered that Margaret's charm hid a calculating mind, and once she decided you were a problem, life in Willow Creek could become unbearable. For years, Margaret's control went unchallenged. Families came and went, eager to keep their heads down and avoid unnecessary conflict. But that changed when the Carters moved into the corner lot at Willow Creek Drive. Daniel and Emily Carter had saved for years to buy the sprawling brick house with its wide backyard. To them, it represented a fresh start, a place to raise their children without the pressures of city living. They admired the tidy lawns and neat sidewalks, assuming the HOA's presence was a good thing, a sign that the neighborhood would remain well-kept and valuable. The first few weeks were uneventful. The Carters unpacked, introduced themselves to neighbors, and enrolled their kids in the local school. But it didn't take long for Margaret to notice small things she didn't like. A tricycle left on the front porch overnight. A recycling bin placed slightly too close to the curb. A garden bed that included flowers she considered too wild. To most, these were minor details. To Margaret, they were threats to her carefully maintained order. Her first letters arrived within days. Printed on HOA letterhead, they carried the sterile authority of official warnings, each one demanding immediate correction. The Carters complied at first, believing they had simply overlooked some rules. But the letters continued. The shade of mulch in their flower bed. The length of the grass, which exceeded the HOA's limit by half an inch. Even the placement of holiday decorations came under scrutiny. Emily grew frustrated, while Daniel tried to reassure her that things would calm down. What they didn't realize was that Margaret had marked them as adversaries, and once that happened, the rules themselves mattered less than the power they represented. The breaking point came when Margaret appeared on their doorstep one Saturday morning. She wasn't alone. 2 board members flanked her, clipboards in hand, as if prepared to conduct an inspection. Margaret announced that the Carters' backyard fence was non-compliant with HOA standard. It was, in fact, the exact same model used by several other homes, but Margaret claimed theirs had been installed improperly and demanded it be replaced. Daniel objected, pointing out that the fence had been approved during the purchase process. Margaret only smiled and reminded him that standards evolve. From that moment, the Carters understood that they were being targeted. Margaret's campaign intensified. Notices arrived weekly, each one more absurd than the last. Neighbors began to whisper, some sympathetic, others too afraid to show support publicly. The Carters filed appeals, but the HOA board, hand-picked by Margaret, sided with her every time. What had once been their dream home began to feel like a gilded cage, with Margaret holding the key. Yet in every story of power, there comes a moment when the balance begins to shift. For the Carters, that moment arrived quietly, almost by accident. While cleaning out the garage, Daniel found a stack of old HOA newsletters left by the previous owners. Leafing through them, he noticed something odd. The rules Margaret enforced so aggressively now had not always existed. In fact, many of them had been introduced only in the past few years, often following disputes with specific homeowners. Each new policy appeared to be less about maintaining property values and more about Margaret's personal grievances. It was a small discovery, but it planted a seed. If Margaret had been rewriting the rules to suit her vendettas, how many other families had suffered in silence? And more importantly, what would happen if someone finally refused to bow to her authority? The Carters didn't yet realize it, but they were about to find out. For years, Willow Creek Estates had thrived on appearances. Manicured lawns, symmetrical hedges, and carefully color-coded holiday decorations gave outsiders the impression of harmony. But beneath the surface, the HOA operated less like a community organization and more like a private regime. Margaret Henderson sat firmly at its center, issuing directives that no one dared to challenge openly. Her influence reached every corner of the neighborhood, from who could park on the cul-de-sac overnight to what kind of shrubs could line a walkway. Most residents told themselves it was easier this way. Margaret was strict, yes, but she kept the neighborhood desirable. Property values rose. Crime stayed low. Even those who disliked her methods often justified them as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. Yet the price of this order was silence. Families learned to tolerate her invasions of privacy, her constant inspections, and her unsolicited advice on how to run their households. The Carters were different, not because they were louder or more defiant than anyone else, but because they had arrived at a time when the neighborhood was already straining under Margaret's control. To many long-term residents, the Carters' early skirmishes with the HOA seemed familiar. Margaret had targeted plenty of families before, but something about this case was different. People noticed how relentless the notices became, how personal the accusations felt, how Margaret seemed determined to break them rather than simply correct small issues. Whispers spread during casual walks, late-night text exchanges, and hushed conversations at the mailbox. A few neighbors, like the Parkers 2 doors down, sympathized quietly but refused to say so publicly. Others, like the Ellisons, applauded Margaret's actions, convinced that strict enforcement protected their investments. For the most part, the neighborhood watched and waited, curious to see how far Margaret would push this conflict. Inside the Carter home, frustration simmered. Emily found herself scanning the yard every morning, half expecting Margaret's shadow to appear with another clipboard. The children picked up on the tension, growing hesitant to play outside, afraid that even their laughter might trigger another complaint. Daniel's discovery of the old newsletters gnawed at him. The realization that Margaret's power rested not on fairness but manipulation shifted his perspective. He began to wonder what would happen if someone truly forced her hand. But challenging Margaret was no simple task. The HOA's rules gave her sweeping authority, and the board she controlled acted as her rubber stamp. Appealing decisions meant paying hefty fees and attending meetings where Margaret presided like a judge, jury, and executioner. Most homeowners gave up before reaching that stage, fearing not just financial costs but social isolation. Margaret had a way of turning dissenters into pariahs, ensuring that their neighbors avoided them, their invitations were declined, and their children were left out of group activities. Daniel's instincts told him that Margaret's power couldn't be absolute. Somewhere, there had to be a weak point. He started by reading through the HOA bylaws, a dense packet of legal jargon the previous owners had stuffed into a forgotten drawer. Hours of late-night study revealed clauses that Margaret never mentioned in her notices: protections for homeowners, appeal processes that bypass the board, and requirements for transparency in financial matters. Most residents, Daniel realized, probably didn't know these provisions existed. Margaret's strategy relied on keeping people ignorant, using selective enforcement to maintain control. Meanwhile, Margaret escalated her campaign. The fence issue became a weekly battle, with letters threatening fines that grew steeper each time. She accused the Carters of lowering community standards by allowing their children to leave chalk drawings on the driveway. Even their mailbox, she claimed, violated the neighborhood aesthetic, despite being identical to 3 others on the same street. Each notice carried the same tone: cold, officious, and laced with the unspoken message that compliance was not optional. Emily grew weary. The home she had once seen as a sanctuary now felt like hostile territory. But Daniel urged patience. He wasn't ready to surrender, not when he could see how unfairly they were being treated. His research continued, and soon he uncovered something even more troubling. The HOA's financial reports, which were supposed to be shared annually, hadn't been distributed in years. When he asked about them at the next board meeting, Margaret brushed off the question, claiming the records were in order. Her dismissive response only deepened his suspicion. The tension reached a peak during the summer barbecue, a community tradition meant to showcase unity. Families gathered at the park, children ran through sprinklers, and picnic tables overflowed with food. Outwardly, it was the picture of suburban bliss. But when Margaret arrived, clipboard in hand, even at a social event, the atmosphere shifted. She made her rounds, commenting on decorations, offering unsolicited advice, and ensuring everyone noticed her presence. When she reached the Carters' table, the silence was palpable. Neighbors avoided eye contact, unwilling to be seen taking side. Margaret complimented Emily's dish in a tone that carried more judgment than praise, then launched into a public reminder about the Carters' ongoing violations. The humiliation was deliberate, and while Emily's cheeks burned with anger, Daniel sat quietly, observing the reactions around them. For the first time, he noticed cracks in Margaret's authority. A few neighbors looked away, uncomfortable with her heavy-handedness. Others whispered behind their hands. It was subtle, but the spell of fear that bound the community seemed to be weakening. Daniel realized that Margaret's power depended not just on the rules but on the perception that no one could stand against her. If that perception changed, everything else might follow. The barbecue ended, but the feeling lingered. On the walk home, Daniel made a decision. He wasn't going to fight Margaret alone, not anymore. If change was going to happen, it would require more than one family's resistance. It would require exposing the truth, building alliances, and reminding Willow Creek that the HOA was supposed to serve the homeowners, not rule them. What he didn't yet know was that Margaret had her own secrets, carefully buried beneath years of polished control. And once those secrets began to surface, the neighborhood would never be the same. The days following the summer barbecue weighed heavily on the Carters. Emily busied herself with the children, trying to shield them from the tension that now shadowed their every move, but Daniel could not shake the memory of Margaret's pointed humiliation. The glances exchanged by neighbors, the subtle discomfort in their body language, these were cracks in her seemingly unbreakable facade. For the first time, Daniel sensed that Margaret might not be untouchable after all. But knowing and proving were two very different things. The bylaws he had unearthed hinted at rights that no one seemed to realize they possessed. Homeowners could request financial audits, call for special meetings, and even propose a vote of no confidence in the board. Yet knowledge alone would not be enough. Margaret had spent years cultivating fear, conditioning the community to accept her dominance. To break that cycle, Daniel needed allies. His first opportunity came during an ordinary evening walk. The sun was dipping below the rooftops when he passed the Parkers' house. Sarah Parker, watering her roses, offered the polite but weary smile of someone who had endured too many HOA notices herself. Daniel paused, commenting on her garden, and the conversation drifted naturally toward neighborhood affairs. With careful phrasing, he mentioned the frequency of Margaret's inspections and the relentlessness of her letters. To his relief, Sarah sighed in agreement. She confided that Margaret once fined them for leaving their garage door open for more than 10 minutes, citing security risks. The absurdity had left them furious, but they had paid the fine anyway, fearing worse consequences if they resisted. Sarah's story confirmed what Daniel suspected. The Carters were not alone. Margaret had weaponized the rules against countless families, but her victims had remained isolated, each believing they were fighting a private battle. Daniel realized that if these voices came together, Margaret's authority could be challenged for the first time. Over the next few weeks, Daniel reached out cautiously. He started small, mentioning his concerns to neighbors during chance encounters, while checking the mail, walking the dog, or waiting for children at the bus stop. Slowly, the stories emerged. The Rodriguezes had been warned about the tone of their exterior paint, even though it matched the approved color palette. The Nguyen's were fined for placing a basketball hoop in their driveway, though several others in the neighborhood had them. The Millers had received repeated notices about their lawn despite maintaining it meticulously. Each account carried the same undercurrent of frustration and helplessness, and with each one, Daniel felt his determination grow. He began documenting these stories, compiling a quiet record of Margaret's selective enforcement. The more he collected, the clearer the pattern became. Rules were not applied consistently. They were bent, reshaped, and weaponized at Margaret's discretion. Still, many neighbors hesitated to take a stand. Fear ran deep in Willow Creek. Margaret's influence extended beyond fines and letters. It touched reputations, social circles, even schoolyard dynamic. Families who had crossed her in the past found themselves subtly ostracized, their children excluded from playdates, their invitations ignored. Few wanted to risk the isolation that came with defiance. Daniel understood this hesitation. He also knew that unless someone acted, Margaret would continue to rule unchecked. So he decided to set an example, not with open confrontation, but with quiet persistence. At the next HOA meeting, he raised the question of financial transparency again. Predictably, Margaret dismissed him, insisting that all records are properly maintained. But this time, he followed up with a formal written request, citing the exact bylaw clause that required annual reports to be shared. Copies of his request circulated quietly among a handful of curious neighbors, sparking whispered conversations about why the records had been withheld. Margaret noticed, of course. Her next letter to the Carters was more aggressive than usual, accusing them of violating landscaping standards with improperly trimmed hedges. Daniel took photographs, comparing his hedges to others on the street. The evidence was clear. Theirs were no different. Margaret was escalating, trying to intimidate him into silence. But instead of backing down, Daniel shared the photos discreetly with Sarah Parker and a few others. The response was immediate, a mixture of outrage and quiet admiration. For the first time, people saw someone standing firm against Margaret's tactic. The tension in the neighborhood thickened. Sidewalk conversations grew more frequent, though always cautious, as if Margaret's eyes and ears lingered everywhere. Families began confiding in Daniel, passing him copies of their old violation notices, many of which bordered on absurd. A picture emerged of a community ruled less by standards and more by one woman's whims. But Margaret was not blind to these shifts. She had built her authority on fear, and she recognized the danger of collective dissent. At the following board meeting, she introduced a proposal for stricter penalties on noncompliance, framing it as necessary for maintaining order. The board, as usual, nodded in agreement, but Daniel noticed the unease in a few members' expressions. Even among her loyalists, doubt was beginning to stir. The proposal passed, but the cracks widened. Daniel's quiet campaign was working, not by shouting down Margaret, but by revealing the truth of her methods. And truth, once seen, could not be unseen. One evening, Sarah Parker knocked on the Carters' door. In her hand was a folder filled with old HOA correspondence. She explained that Margaret had once accused her of diminishing property values because her roses were not pruned to the association's standards. Sarah had kept every letter, every fine, every absurd demand. She admitted she had been too afraid to fight back alone, but now, seeing Daniel's persistence, she was ready. That night, as Daniel flipped through the stack of documents, he felt a shift. Margaret's authority no longer seemed absolute. Piece by piece, her empire was being documented, challenged, and prepared for exposure. But Margaret, sensing the threat, was preparing too. Behind her polite smiles and carefully worded notices, she was already planning her next move, a move that would turn the entire neighborhood against the Carters if she succeeded. The Carters had found their first ally and momentum was building. But Margaret had ruled Willow Creek for too long to surrender easily. The next chapter of this battle would pit neighbor against neighbor, as Margaret worked to isolate the Carters before their quiet rebellion could spread any further. Margaret Henderson had not maintained her iron grip on Willow Creek estates for nearly 2 decades by chance. She understood people better than they understood themselves, and she wielded that knowledge with precision. When someone resisted her authority, she rarely relied on rules alone. Instead, she weaponized reputation, perception, and the subtle fear of social exclusion. The Carters, she decided, would be no different. Her first step was a familiar one: control the narrative. At the next community gathering, a Saturday morning coffee social in the clubhouse, Margaret arrived early, her ever-present clipboard tucked neatly under her arm. She made her rounds, greeting residents with warmth that felt genuine on the surface, but every word carried intent. She spoke of families who don't value our community standards, of those who think the rules don't apply to them, and of problems that, if left unchecked, could lower all of our property values. She never mentioned the Carters by name, but the implication was clear. People connected the dot. Whispers spread across the room as neighbors nodded, some in agreement, others out of fear of appearing disloyal. Margaret didn't need to call for action. She simply planted the seeds, letting suspicion grow. Soon after, subtle shifts occurred in the Carters' daily life. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings no longer arrived. Friendly waves from passing cars became curt nods or, worse, deliberate avoidance. The children found themselves excluded from impromptu games at the park, the laughter of their peers replaced with whispers and side glances. Emily felt it most acutely, her once hopeful view of suburban life collapsing under the weight of isolation. For Margaret, this was victory. Divide and conquer. Make resistance costly. She knew from experience that most families could not withstand the pressure of social exile. Eventually, they would bend, comply, or quietly move away. But Daniel was not most families. While Emily struggled with the growing hostility, Daniel doubled down on his quiet campaign. The folder Sarah Parker had given him was only the beginning. More neighbors, emboldened by whispers of his persistence, slipped him old notices, fines, and documents they had once hidden away in frustration. Patterns became undeniable. Violations cited inconsistently, rules applied selectively, fines levied without proper documentation. Still, Margaret's grip remained strong. When Daniel attempted to bring up these inconsistencies at the next HOA meeting, Margaret cut him off, her voice sharp but controlled. She accused him of spreading misinformation, of trying to undermine community harmony. Her loyal board members echoed her, nodding in agreement. The few who wavered stayed silent, unwilling to challenge her openly. Yet Daniel noticed something Margaret perhaps did not. Not everyone was convinced. A handful of neighbors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes betraying doubt. Margaret had won the battle of that night, but she had not silenced the questions. Her counterattack escalated. A formal violation notice arrived at the Carter home, accusing them of harboring unsightly clutter in their backyard. Attached were grainy photos, taken clearly from behind a fence or through bushes, of children's toys, a lawn chair, and a garden hose left out after use. The message was obvious. Margaret was watching, and no detail was too small. Emily's patience frayed. She urged Daniel to let it go, to stop provoking Margaret before things grew worse. But Daniel couldn't ignore the injustice. He knew that giving in would only embolden her further. The bylaws sat fresh in his mind, their protective clauses just waiting to be tested. He began drafting a formal petition for an independent review of the HOA's practices, a move that could only succeed with significant homeowner support. Margaret, sensing the danger, launched her most effective weapon, fear of financial loss. Letters began circulating, carefully worded, but unmistakable in intent, warning residents that frivolous challenges to the HOA could result in legal fees shared by all homeowners. She painted Daniel's efforts as reckless, a threat not just to her authority, but to the wallets of every family in Willow Creek. The tactic worked. Neighbors who had begun to sympathize with the Carters pulled back, fearful of costly entanglements. Margaret had reframed the conflict, turning Daniel into the villain, a selfish man risking everyone's stability for his personal vendetta. For Emily, the weight was unbearable. Grocery trips brought sidelong glances. School pickups came with frosty silence from other parents. Even church gatherings felt strained, with whispers echoing behind her as she walked past. What had once been a dream home was now a gilded cage of scrutiny. But Daniel refused to waver. He understood what Margaret did not. Fear could silence individuals, but truth had a way of spreading once it was exposed. And the more Margaret tightened her grip, the more cracks began to show. Late one evening, Sarah Parker returned, not just with documents this time, but with a quiet admission. She wasn't the only one who had grown tired of Margaret's reign. A small group of neighbors had begun meeting informally, away from Margaret's watchful eyes. They were ready to speak up, but only if someone would lead the charge. Daniel knew the risk. If they failed, Margaret would make their lives unbearable. But if they succeeded, Willow Creek could finally be free from her stranglehold. The battle was no longer just between the Carters and Margaret. The neighborhood itself was beginning to divide, lines drawn between those who feared change and those desperate for it. And Margaret, though she sensed rebellion brewing, believed she still held the upper hand. What she didn't realize was that her own secrets, the ones buried in the HOA's neglected financial records, were about to surface. And when they did, her empire would tremble. The Carters were isolated, targeted, and branded as troublemakers. But in the shadows, alliances were forming. The rebellion Margaret feared most was no longer hypothetical, it was real, and it was gaining strength. The informal meetings began quietly, held in living rooms with blinds drawn and voices lowered. Sarah Parker introduced Daniel to a handful of other homeowners, families who had grown weary of Margaret's endless micromanagement but had never dared to resist on their own. They gathered cautiously, half expecting Margaret's shadow to fall across the window at any moment, clipboard in hand. Each person carried stories like scars. The Rodriguezes, fined repeatedly for the wrong shade of outdoor lighting. The Millers, harassed for hosting family barbecues that Margaret deemed too disruptive. The Nguyen's, threatened with escalating penalties after a single late HOA fee payment, despite having never missed one before. Some had boxes of old notices and letters, relics of battles long ago lost. Others carried only bitter memories, still sharp despite the passage of years. Daniel listened, took notes, and began assembling a picture that was impossible to ignore. Margaret's so-called enforcement was not about maintaining standards, it was about control. The rules shifted depending on her mood, her grudges, and her desire to remind the neighborhood who held power. As the group compared documents, patterns emerged. Certain violations appeared selectively enforced, often against families who had disagreed with Margaret publicly. Fines seemed to grow steeper with no clear basis. And perhaps most damning of all, the financial trail was murky at best. Annual reports had been skipped. Special maintenance fees were collected but never itemized. Projects were approved with no visible result. It became clear to Daniel that the HOA was not just poorly managed, it was being manipulated. Money was flowing somewhere, and Margaret was at the center of it. The allies agreed on one thing: if they wanted change, they needed evidence. Rumors and frustration would not topple Margaret's empire. They needed proof, documents, records, and undeniable fact. Daniel took on the role of organizer, creating a shared folder where members could deposit scanned notices, receipts, and correspondence. Late nights turned into hours of cross-referencing dates, comparing handwriting, and identifying inconsistencies. Sarah Parker became the group's archivist, her meticulous nature uncovering connections others overlooked. The Rodriguezes, with their background in accounting, began analyzing the few financial statements they could find, noting gaps and unexplained expenses. Piece by piece, a case began to form. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her campaign against the Carters. Another violation notice arrived, this time accusing them of operating a commercial enterprise from their home because Daniel had parked a company-marked van in the driveway overnight. The claim was absurd, but the intent was clear: wear them down, drain them with fines, and push them out. But this time, the Carters weren't alone. The next day, Sarah Parker appeared with a folder of her own. She had compiled photos of other residents with company vehicles in their driveways, delivery vans, construction trucks, and landscaping trailers. None of them had ever been fined. The evidence was damning. Margaret's rules weren't rules at all. They were weapons used selectively against those who opposed her. The group decided to act cautiously at first. They drafted anonymous letters outlining their concerns, slipping them into mailboxes around the neighborhood. The letters highlighted inconsistencies in enforcement and called for financial transparency, citing specific clauses from the HOA bylaws. While unsigned, they carried a tone of authority that unsettled the community. Reactions varied. Some homeowners dismissed the letters as troublemaking. Others, quietly, began to ask questions. At the next HOA meeting, several residents raised their hands to request financial reports, requests Margaret deflected with practiced ease, insisting that all records are properly maintained. But Daniel noticed something important. The room no longer nodded in unison. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, subtle but undeniable. Margaret sensed the shift. Her eyes swept the room, narrowing slightly as if she could smell the rebellion forming. Her smile grew tighter, her answers more clipped. The Queen of Willow Creek was not accustomed to being questioned, and she would not tolerate it for long. The Allies knew time was running short. Margaret's next move would be decisive, and they needed irrefutable evidence before she struck back. That meant going deeper, into the HOA's finances, into old meeting minutes, into anything that could prove mismanagement or worse. But Margaret, ever vigilant, had already anticipated the threat. Her next violation notice did not target the Carters directly. Instead, it went to the Parkers. A steep fine for unauthorized modifications to their flower beds. The message was unmistakable. Margaret had noticed Sarah's alignment with the Carters, and she was prepared to punish anyone who stood beside them. The group felt the weight of the warning. Fear crept in. If Margaret could turn her wrath on anyone, what hope did they have? Yet Sarah, her hands shaking as she handed the notice to Daniel, whispered words that hardened their resolve. If she's going to come after us anyway, then we can't back down. The rebellion was no longer theoretical. It was real, it was personal, and it was dangerous. Margaret had ruled Willow Creek with fear for too long. Now, fear was turning against her. The Carters and their allies had the beginnings of a case, but Margaret had drawn her own battle lines. With punishments spreading beyond the Carters' home, the neighborhood was being forced to choose sides. The next move would determine whether the rebellion collapsed or ignited into open war. The air in Willow Creek estates grew heavier with each passing week. On the surface, the lawns remained trimmed, the fences painted, and the houses spotless. But behind closed doors, tension simmered. Neighbors who once exchanged casual greetings now whispered nervously, wondering who might be the next target of Margaret Henderson's scrutiny. The anonymous letters had left their mark. Even those who avoided conflict could not ignore the questions raised. Where were the missing financial reports? Why were rules applied inconsistently? Margaret had brushed off the concerns at the last meeting, but her dismissive tone lingered like smoke. For the first time in years, her authority was being questioned openly, even if only in murmurs. Margaret responded the only way she knew how, by tightening her grip. Violation notices began arriving with startling frequency. The Parkers were fined for flowerbeds, the Rodriguezes for leaving recycling bins visible too early, and the Nguyen's for unapproved decorative items on their porch. Each notice was couched in official language, but the timing was clear. Margaret was sending a message: resistance would be punished. The neighborhood took notice. Some families grew fearful, withdrawing from the Carters and their small circle of allies. Others grew angry, tired of being ruled by a woman who seemed more interested in control than community. The line between loyalty and rebellion blurred with every notice slipped into a mailbox. Daniel watched it unfold with grim determination. He knew Margaret was trying to fracture their alliance, to isolate them until the rebellion withered. But each new notice only strengthened his resolve. The evidence they had gathered was damning, yet it was scattered, pieces of a puzzle that needed to be assembled before anyone outside their group would take it seriously. The breakthrough came when the Rodriguezes, digging through their files, discovered an old invoice from a special landscaping project, charged to every household years earlier. The fee had been steep, but no such project had ever materialized. Cross-checking with HOA records, the allies found that thousands of dollars had been collected but never accounted for. The money had vanished. It was the smoking gun they needed. Armed with this discovery, Daniel and his group prepared for the next HOA meeting. Unlike previous gatherings, this one carried a sense of anticipation. Word had spread that something was brewing. Attendance doubled, with families filling the clubhouse until every chair was occupied. Margaret sat at the head of the long table, her clipboard resting neatly before her, her smile calm but brittle. She knew a storm was coming. The meeting began as usual, with routine announcements about lawn maintenance schedules and upcoming community events. But the tension was palpable. When the floor opened for homeowner concerns, Daniel stood. His voice was steady as he requested clarification on the landscaping project funds. He held up the invoice for all to see. The room stirred. Neighbors leaned forward, whispers rippling like wind across tall grass. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She dismissed the question, claiming the records were archived and not immediately available. But Daniel pressed, citing the bylaw clause requiring transparency and annual reporting. He reminded everyone that no such reports had been issued in years. For a moment the room fell silent. Margaret's authority had been challenged directly, in front of the very people she relied upon to maintain her power. She responded with the full force of her practiced control. Her voice sharpened, accusing Daniel of spreading lies, of attacking community leadership for personal gain. She painted him as reckless, a threat to the stability and property values everyone cherished. But the damage was done. The murmurs didn't die this time. They grew louder. Some nodded at Margaret's words, clinging to the safety of her authority. Others exchanged looks of doubt, their confidence shaken by the evidence Daniel had displayed. For the first time the room was divided. Emily sat in the back, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could feel the weight of the room shifting, the fragile balance tipping. Every second stretched long, the outcome uncertain. Sensing her grip slipping, Margaret called for order. She announced a vote on stricter enforcement measures, framing it as necessary to restore unity in the neighborhood. It was a calculated move, an attempt to force residents to choose between loyalty and dissent. If she won the vote, her authority would be reaffirmed. If she lost, her reign would begin to crumble. The ballots were passed around, tension thick in the air. Families glanced at one another nervously, torn between fear of Margaret's wrath and frustration at her heavy hand. Pens scratched paper, hands trembled, and silence fell as the votes were collected. When the results were tallied, the outcome stunned everyone. Margaret's proposal passed, but only by a narrow margin. Half the room had defied her. Half the neighborhood had dared to push back. For Margaret, the victory felt hollow. She had won the vote, but lost her aura of invincibility. The rebellion she feared was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was here, alive and growing stronger. Daniel left the meeting knowing they had reached a tipping point. Margaret would not forgive his public defiance. She would come after him harder than ever. But the narrow vote revealed something even more important. She no longer controlled Willow Creek entirely. The battle for the neighborhood had shifted from whispers to open confrontation, and neither side would back down. The narrow margin of victory at the HOA meeting haunted Margaret Henderson long after the clubhouse lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed. She had kept her crown, yes, but the cracks were showing. For years, her authority had been absolute. People complied without question, cowed by her notices and intimidated by her reputation. But now, half the neighborhood had openly defied her. Margaret did not tolerate defiance. In the days that followed, her retaliation against the Carters grew ruthless. A letter arrived accusing them of violating seasonal decoration guidelines, for leaving a wreath on their front door beyond the approved period. Another claimed their children's chalk drawings on the driveway constituted graffiti. A third notice, the harshest yet, alleged that their fence, a dispute Margaret had resurrected repeatedly, posed a safety hazard and required immediate removal. Each notice came with escalating fines, the amounts growing so absurd that even Emily, weary from months of harassment, could hardly believe the numbers. What had once been a nuisance now threatened to become financial ruin. Margaret wasn't just trying to control them anymore, she was trying to crush them. But Margaret's assault did not stop at paper. She understood the power of perception, and she wielded it like a weapon. At neighborhood gatherings, she dropped casual remarks about the Carters being irresponsible homeowners, warning others that their actions could drag down property values. She implied that Daniel was unstable, obsessed with undermining the HOA rather than contributing to the community. Whispers spread, and soon the Carters' name carried a shadow wherever it was spoken. The children felt it too. At school, their classmates repeated fragments of their parents' conversations, calling them the trouble family. Playdates were canceled. Birthday invitations stopped arriving. Emily's heart broke each time her children asked why their friends no longer wanted to come over. Margaret hadn't just isolated them socially, she was poisoning their reputation beyond the neighborhood's borders. Daniel bore the brunt of it. At work, he found himself distracted, replaying HOA clauses in his mind, cataloging evidence late into the night. He watched Emily's exhaustion grow and his children's joy fade. Guilt gnawed at him. Had his fight made things worse? Was Margaret right, that challenging her meant risking everything? Yet with every doubt, he returned to the folder of evidence. The vanished landscaping funds, the inconsistent enforcement, the selective targeting of families who dared to question her. This wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about an entire neighborhood that had been bullied into silence for too long. But Margaret was not finished. Her most audacious strike came in the form of a letter delivered not just to the Carters, but to every mailbox in Willow Creek. Written on official HOA letterhead, it accused Daniel Carter of spreading malicious lies and seeking to destabilize the community. It warned homeowners that any association with his campaign of misinformation could result in shared liability for legal costs. The letter was Margaret's masterstroke, a public condemnation that painted Daniel as a reckless agitator and threatened collective punishment for anyone who supported him. Fear rippled through the neighborhood. Families who had begun to edge toward Daniel's side recoiled, terrified of being dragged into costly battles. For Emily, it was nearly the breaking point. She begged Daniel to stop, to think of the children, to consider selling the house and leaving Willow Creek behind. The dream they had once cherished had curdled into a nightmare. Freedom, she argued, might lie not in victory, but in escape. But Daniel could not walk away, not now. Margaret's letter had crossed a line. She had taken her vendetta public, and in doing so, revealed the depth of her fear. Her empire was built on control, but control depended on secrecy. Now, the conflict was out in the open, visible to everyone. That night, Daniel met with his allies. The Parkers, the Rodriguezes, the Nguyen's, and a handful of others gathered once more, their faces grim. The letter had shaken them, but it had also united them. If Margaret was willing to threaten the entire community, then the problem was no longer just about one family. It was systemic. The group agreed. It was time to escalate. Quiet whispers and anonymous letters were no longer enough. They needed to go public with their evidence. Every violation, every missing report, every vanished dollar. They would compile their findings into a single document and distribute it to every household in Willow Creek. Margaret's rule would be exposed not in hushed conversations, but in undeniable black and white. But Margaret was already preparing her next move. She had friends on the board, loyalists who owed their positions to her influence, and she had no intention of allowing Daniel's rebellion to spread unchecked. The stage was set for the most explosive HOA meeting in Willow Creek history, one that would decide not just the fate of the Carters, but the future of the entire neighborhood. Margaret's retaliation had reached new heights, isolating the Carters and branding Daniel a public enemy. But the evidence against her was ready, and the allies were preparing to unleash it. The next meeting would not be business as usual, it would be war. The clubhouse had never been so full. Word of Margaret Henderson's public letter condemning Daniel Carter had spread like wildfire through Willow Creek, and curiosity drew families who rarely bothered with HOA meetings. Some came out of loyalty to Margaret, others out of frustration with her, and many simply wanted to witness the spectacle. Rows of folding chairs filled the hall, children fidgeted in corners, and voices buzzed with anticipation. Margaret sat at the head of the long table, her clipboard resting like a gavel of authority. Her smile was fixed but strained, the kind that revealed more tension than confidence. Around her sat the board members, loyal as ever, though a few avoided her gaze. Daniel felt the weight of every eye as he entered with Emily and their allies. His hands carried a thick binder, pages of evidence painstakingly compiled over weeks. Each document, each photograph, each receipt represented not just his family's suffering, but years of Margaret's unchecked rule. The meeting began as it always did. Minutes read, announcements made, the illusion of order maintained. But everyone in the room knew it was a prelude. The storm would break when the floor opened for concerns. When it did, Daniel stood. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dozens of neighbors leaned forward, eager for confrontation. Margaret adjusted her glasses, her voice sharp as she asked if he had more misinformation to share. Daniel did not rise to her bait. Instead, he opened the binder and began reading. He started with the small things. Notices issued inconsistently, fines levied without basis, rules applied to some families and ignored for others. He held up photographs, pointing to identical circumstances treated differently depending on whether a homeowner had fallen out of Margaret's favor. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, recognition flashing in faces as people saw their own experiences reflected. Then he moved to the finances. Copies of invoices for projects that never materialized. Records of fees collected without explanation. The missing landscaping project that had cost every family hundreds of dollars, yet left no visible result. The Rodriguez's accounting notes highlighted gaps that couldn't be explained away as clerical errors. The binder told a story that was undeniable. Money had been mismanaged, perhaps even stolen, and Margaret had hidden it behind years of intimidation. The room shifted. Some gasped. Others exchanged looks of shock and anger. The murmurs grew into open questions, directed not at Daniel, but at Margaret. For the first time, the Queen of Willow Creek was on the defensive. Margaret's smile faltered, but her voice sharpened with venom. She accused Daniel of fabricating evidence, of conspiring with disgruntled residents to destroy community harmony. She insisted the finances were in order, that reports were filed properly and could be retrieved in due time. But her words rang hollow. Too many homeowners had lived under her heavy hand, too many had endured her selective punishments. The binder was not a conspiracy, it was confirmation of what they already suspected. A voice from the back spoke up. Then another. Homeowners who had once stayed silent began sharing their own stories, fines that made no sense, threats for minor infractions, letters laced with intimidation. The room, once united in fearful silence, had become a chorus of dissent. Margaret pounded the table, demanding order. But order was gone. The board, visibly shaken, conferred in hurried whispers. Their loyalty wavered under the weight of the evidence and the rising anger of the crowd. One member, pale and sweating, finally spoke. The bylaws required an independent audit if requested by a majority of homeowners. If the community demanded it, Margaret could not refuse. The room erupted. Hands shot up, voices clamored, and the motion for an audit passed with overwhelming support. Margaret's face drained of color. Her authority, once absolute, was slipping away before her eyes. Emily, sitting quietly in the back, felt tears sting her eyes, not of fear this time, but of relief. For months they had endured isolation, humiliation, and punishment. Now the truth was out. The burden was no longer theirs alone. But Margaret was not finished. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, she stood, her voice trembling with fury. She warned that the audit would vindicate her, that the Carters would be exposed as liars, that those who had turned against her would regret their betrayal. Her words carried venom, but not conviction. The spell of fear had been broken. Daniel closed the binder, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He knew the battle was not over. Margaret would not surrender quietly. But for the first time, the neighborhood had seen her vulnerability. The Queen was bleeding, and the kingdom had noticed. The meeting ended in a flurry of arguments and hurried departures. Neighbors who had once avoided the Carters approached quietly, offering words of support, tentative but genuine. The tide was turning. Still, in the quiet walk home, Daniel couldn't shake a gnawing thought. Margaret was cornered now, and cornered opponents were dangerous. Whatever came next would not be subtle notices or whispered rumors. It would be something bigger, something designed to break him completely. The vote for an independent audit had shaken Willow Creek to its core. For the first time in years, Margaret Henderson no longer ruled with unquestioned authority. Neighbors who once trembled at her letters now whispered openly about her downfall. But Margaret was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was a fighter, a manipulator, and above all, a survivor. And she was prepared to use every weapon at her disposal to protect her throne. Her retaliation came swiftly. The very next morning, Daniel received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, an aggressive notice accusing him of defamation, harassment, and disruption of community governance. The letter threatened legal action, citing vague claims of damages to the association's reputation. It was a bold move, designed to intimidate not only Daniel but anyone who dared to stand with him. Emily felt her chest tighten as she read the words. The threat of a lawsuit wasn't just frightening, it was financially devastating. They could not afford years of legal battles. That was Margaret's strategy, to drown them in fear of ruin before the audit could take place. But the tactic backfired in unexpected ways. Word of the letter spread quickly through the neighborhood, and whispers of lawsuit threats ignited fresh outrage. Some residents who had remained neutral now began to question Margaret's motives. Why, they asked, would a fair leader resort to legal intimidation instead of simply presenting the financial records? Margaret sensed her grip slipping further and escalated again. She orchestrated a smear campaign, enlisting her loyalists to spread rumors about Daniel. At the community playground, whispers painted him as a man obsessed, unstable, even dangerous. Social media posts appeared in local groups, vague but poisonous, warning of troublemakers trying to dismantle the HOA. The Carters felt the weight of every lie. Emily endured cold stares at the grocery store. The children came home in tears after classmates repeated rumors that their father was getting sued and might go to jail. Daniel clenched his fists in private, fury simmering, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing control was exactly what Margaret wanted. Amid the storm, the allies held firm. Sarah Parker reminded them all that bullies lashed out hardest when cornered. The Rodriguezes pushed forward with their accounting analysis, uncovering even more suspicious gaps. The Nguyen's spoke quietly to neighbors, encouraging them not to lose heart. Together, they formed a backbone of resistance that Margaret could not fully break. But Margaret's most desperate move came just weeks before the audit was scheduled to begin. She called an emergency HOA meeting, her loyalists rallying to pack the room. With fiery rhetoric, she proposed a motion to remove Daniel Carter from the community altogether, claiming he was in chronic violation of HOA standards and had become a destabilizing influence threatening property values. It was a nuclear option, expulsion from Willow Creek. If passed, it would force the Carters to sell their home and leave. The clubhouse filled with tension so thick it felt suffocating. Margaret stood tall, her voice sharp and commanding, painting a picture of Daniel as a cancer in the community. She cited his supposed violations, his defiance of rules, and the division he had caused. She reminded everyone of the looming lawsuit, casting him as reckless and selfish. But when she called for a vote, something remarkable happened. Hands did not rise in unison. Instead, hesitation filled the room. Families exchanged glances, their faces conflicted. Some loyalists raised their hands, yes, but the majority remained frozen. The memory of Daniel's binder, of the missing funds, of Margaret's endless notices and threats, lingered too strongly. A voice rose from the back. It was Sarah Parker. Calm but firm, she reminded the room that the bylaws guaranteed transparency, that the audit had been lawfully demanded, and that Daniel's only crime was asking for answers. Her words carried a weight Margaret could not match. Slowly, other voices joined in. The Rodriguezes spoke of unexplained fees. The Nguyen's recalled fines that made no sense. The tide of opinion turned before Margaret's eyes. When the final count was tallied, the motion to expel Daniel failed by a wide margin. Margaret had overplayed her hand. Her desperate gambit had not crushed the rebellion, it had revealed her fear. Daniel walked home that night with Emily and the children, his shoulders heavy but his heart steadier than it had been in months. They were still under siege, yes, but for the first time, Margaret had failed. The Queen's power was slipping away, and everyone knew it. Still, he couldn't shake a lingering unease. Margaret had been humiliated in public, and people like her didn't fade quietly, they burned everything on the way down. The audit loomed, promising to uncover the truth once and for all. Margaret had one final chance to protect her empire, and Daniel knew she would stop at nothing. The day of the audit arrived like a storm rolling over Willow Creek. For weeks, tension had crackled through the neighborhood, each passing day thick with anticipation. Margaret Henderson had ruled for so long that many could scarcely imagine life without her. But now, an independent auditor, outside the reach of her influence, was about to peel back the curtain. The clubhouse was overflowing. Families who had avoided meetings for years packed the seats, standing shoulder to shoulder in the back, their voices hushed. Children clung to parents, sensing the weight of the moment. Everyone had come to see the reckoning. Margaret sat at the head table as always, clipboard before her like a shield. Her smile was polished, but her eyes betrayed unease. The board members flanked her, their loyalty tested but unbroken, for now. Daniel sat with Emily and their allies, binder of evidence resting on his lap like a weapon. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of what was about to unfold. The auditor, a quiet man in a gray suit, began with numbers. He spoke in calm, measured tones, flipping through pages of financial statements and cross-referencing them with HOA record. First, the findings were small, Clerical inconsistencies, delayed filings, minor errors. Margaret sat taller, her smile tightening as if to suggest vindication. But then the cracks widened. The auditor revealed that several special fees, collected for projects like landscaping upgrades, security improvements, and clubhouse renovations, had no corresponding expenditures. Thousands of dollars had been taken from homeowners, but no work had ever been completed. The funds had been rerouted into accounts controlled solely by Margaret. Gasps rippled through the room. Neighbors exchanged wide-eyed looks, mouths hanging open. The words embezzlement and theft whispered from row to row like sparks catching dry grass. Margaret's smile vanished. She interrupted, insisting the funds were earmarked for future use. But the auditor shook his head. The money was gone. Withdrawn. Unaccounted for. The revelations continued. Checks written to companies that didn't exist. Payments marked for consulting with no records of service. Expenses filed under categories that had no connection to HOA responsibilities. Each page was another nail in the coffin of Margaret's reign. By the time the auditor finished, the room was electric. Anger, disbelief, and betrayal swirled together in a storm of voices. Margaret's loyalists sat pale and silent, their faith shattered. The board members avoided her gaze, knowing they had allowed her to lead them into disgrace. Daniel rose, his voice steady as he addressed the room. He reminded everyone of the years of intimidation, the endless notices, the selective enforcement. He spoke of the families silenced, the children isolated, the neighbors divided. And then he said what no one else dared. This was never about community standards. This was about power. And it ends tonight. Applause erupted, raw and thunderous. Margaret stood, her face flushed with fury. She pounded the table, shouting that she was the victim of a smear campaign, that the Carters had orchestrated everything to destroy her. But her words fell flat. The spell of fear was broken. The neighborhood no longer saw a queen, they saw a fraud. The board moved quickly. Bylaw clauses were cited, motions introduced, and votes taken. Margaret Henderson was removed as HOA president effective immediately. An interim committee was formed to oversee operations until new elections could be held. The auditor's findings would be referred to legal authorities. Margaret's reign was over. The clubhouse erupted with relief. Neighbors embraced, some with tears in their eyes. Families who had once avoided the Carters approached them with apologies and gratitude. The Carters were no longer pariahs. They were the catalysts of change. As the crowd dispersed, Margaret stood alone at the front of the room, her clipboard hanging limply at her side. The woman who had once ruled with iron certainty now looked small, diminished, and powerless. For all her threats and schemes, she had been undone not by force, but by truth. That night, the Carters returned home to a neighborhood transformed. Porch lights glowed warmly, children laughed freely, and for the first time since moving in, Emily felt a sense of peace. The house that had once felt like a cage now felt like a victory. Daniel sat on the porch, binder still at his side, watching as neighbors walked by, not with cold stares, but with nods of respect. He knew the road ahead would not be simple. Elections would bring new challenges, new disagreements. But the era of fear was over. Willow Creek could finally be a community again. And Margaret Henderson, once the unchallenged queen of the neighborhood, faded into memory, a cautionary tale of power abused and truth revealed.